The hardest part of losing a farm is not watching the money disappear. It is watching your child start paying for food you can no longer afford. At 41, Rachel Bennett had reached that point on Maple Ridge Homestead, 7 acres in the mountains of western North Carolina. After a divorce and the collapse of 2 bee colonies, every bill felt heavier, and seeing her 16-year-old son Caleb take extra shifts at a feed store and slip part of his paycheck toward groceries cut deeper than any financial loss. Rachel kept telling him to save his money, but they both knew why he was doing it. Then, while clearing an abandoned corner beneath warped boards and dusty tarps, she found something she had not seen in years. A hollow log beehive once used by her late great-uncle, Walter Green. The wood was split, gray with age, and so primitive that beekeeper Hank Dalton nearly laughed when he saw it. There were no removable frames, no easy way to inspect brood, no reliable way to check the queen, food stores, mites, or disease. Hank told her what any experienced beekeeper would have said. The thing belonged on a burn pile, not in a working bee yard. Rachel knew he was right, and that made the choice harder. Other beekeepers she knew had thousands of dollars invested. She cleared the debris, patched the cracks, and decided to give it one chance. Not because she believed old ways were magically better, but because desperation had left her with one question she could not ignore. Before modern equipment made it easy to look inside a hive, what did beekeepers like Walter learn to notice outside it? But what Rachel discovered next was more unsettling than Hank's warning, because the old hive's greatest weakness might be the very thing that forced earlier beekeepers to notice what modern equipment made easy to overlook. Over the next several nights, she read about the old Appalachian bee gum tradition. Farmers across the mountains south had long used hollow sections of black gum and other trees as simple bee homes. The bees built comb directly against the cavity walls, and the farmer needed little more than sound wood, a dry cover, and a suitable place to set it. It was cheap, practical, and born from necessity. But Rachel quickly understood why serious beekeeping had moved on. A Langstroth hive could be opened frame by frame. A beekeeper could inspect brood, find the queen, judge food stores, monitor mites, spot disease, and measure colony strength before trouble became disaster. Walter's hollow log offered almost none of that. Rachel did not romanticize it. She still trusted her modern hives, and she knew inspection could save colonies. Yet the limitation bothered her. If Walter could not constantly open a box and look for answers, where had he looked instead? The question changed how she approached the hive. She cleaned out decades of debris, patched the split wood, tightened the weathered top, and raised the log on blocks above damp ground. Then she carried it toward the creek, near the place where family stories said Walter once kept bees. Standing there, Rachel realized technology had made some information so convenient that other signals could fade into the background, almost out of sight. But the next thing Rachel found would test more than the old hive. It would test whether she had been asking the wrong question from the beginning. In late spring, Caleb came running from the creek with news that stopped her cold. A wild swarm was hanging from... Rachel could not afford a package of bees or a purchased queen, so she moved quickly. Using the simplest method she remembered from Walter's stories, she clipped the branch, lowered the swarm near the hollow log entrance, and let the bees make the final choice themselves. By the next morning, the old hive was humming. Workers streamed in and out. Within days, returning bees carried yellow pollen on their legs, and for the first time in months, Rachel felt hope. Hank Dalton heard about it and laughed that she had somehow found free bees for a free hive. For nearly 3 weeks, it looked as if he might be wrong. Then the mountains changed. Cold Appalachian rains settled over Yancey County. Nighttime temperatures dropped, and the spring bloom seemed to shut down overnight. Bee traffic thinned, pollen returns slowed. By the end of the week, the entrance that had been alive with movement looked nearly abandoned. Rachel stood in the wet grass before sunrise, staring at the dark opening and feeling every weakness Hank had warned her about. She could not pull a frame to see whether the queen was alive. She could not check brood, measure food stores, or look for disease. All she had was silence, rain, and the sickening thought that she had wasted time on a relic that had failed exactly as everyone predicted. Her first instinct was to blame the hive. Farmers do that because the visible thing is easiest to accuse: the seed, breed, fertilizer, machine, irrigation line, or box itself. But as Rachel watched water bead on the old wood, another possibility began to bother her. What if the hive had not failed at all? What if the problem was not inside the log, but around it? And what if the mistake had been hers before the bees ever moved in? But the answer Rachel needed was not hidden inside the silent hive at all. It had been waiting for decades in a stained notebook buried in the back of Walter Green's old Rachel expected honey totals, queen notes, maybe records of swarms. Instead, Walter had written down wind direction, nighttime lows, the hour bees first began flying, how long each yard stayed in morning shade, creek levels, blooming plants, pollen colors, and the direction workers returned from the hills. He had not been studying the hive alone. He had been studying the entire farm around it. Rachel began copying his habit. Before breakfast each morning, she stood near the creek with a notebook and recorded temperature, first flight time, shade, wind, forage, and the direction the bees traveled. For several days, the numbers looked random. Then, a pattern appeared. On clear nights, cold air slid down the mountain slope and pooled along the creek bottom. Walter's old hive sat directly in that pocket, remaining colder longer after sunrise. But the deeper discovery came when Rachel compared Walter's notes with the land in front of her. The farm he had known no longer existed in quite the same form. Young trees from his time had grown into a heavy canopy that blocked early sunlight. A line of shrubs that once broke the valley wind had disappeared. Drainage had shifted after years of erosion, and vegetation along the pasture edge had changed. Rachel finally saw the mistake. She had copied Walter's location without copying his reasoning. Walter had not placed bees near the creek because tradition demanded it. He had chosen that spot because, decades earlier, the conditions there were favorable. Rachel had treated an old decision like a permanent recipe. But farms never stand still. Trees grow, buildings rise, wind breaks vanish, water paths change, fields change crops, and a place that once protected livestock or bees can become cold, damp, exposed, or barren years later. Tradition, Rachel realized, should preserve the thinking behind a decision, not freeze the decision forever. Walter's wisdom was not that old farmers possessed secret knowledge. It was that they kept reading the land and changing with it. And for the first time, Rachel stopped asking what was wrong with Walter's hive. She started asking what had changed in the world surrounding it. But what Rachel did next was so modest that Hank would have dismissed it. And that was exactly why the change mattered. She moved Walter's hollow hive only 60 feet uphill. No new queen, no expensive feed, no medication, no new equipment. Just 60 feet. The new spot caught the first warmth of morning sun, slipped into shade during hot afternoons, drained better after rain, and sat behind enough cedar and brush to break the prevailing wind. The creek was close, but cold air could now flow past the hive instead of settling around it. For a few days, Rachel saw nothing dramatic. Then the entrance began to wake up. A few workers became dozens. Returning bees carried yellow and cream-colored pollen, and their flight lines became steady enough for Rachel to follow. She marked the directions in Walter's notebook, then walked the farm. Along the fence, she found blackberry. In the pasture, clover. Near the woods, sourwood. Farther out, goldenrod was building for late summer. Rachel started sketching a simple forage map, and a new pattern emerged. Morning sun affected temperature. Wind protection affected how much energy bees spent keeping the colony stable. Nearby water reduced travel. A sequence of blooming plants determined whether food was available week after week instead of all at once. She drew a triangle in the margin and labeled its 3 sides: microclimate, shelter, forage. Soon she called it her bee-yard triangle. The hive no longer looked like an isolated box. It looked like one point inside a much larger system. And the idea reached beyond beekeeping. A chicken coop in the wrong wind, a vegetable bed trapped in shade, an orchard in a frost pocket, or an irrigation line fighting poor drainage could all suffer for the same reason. Farmers often spend money trying to improve what sits in a place, before asking whether the place itself is working against them. Rachel had changed almost nothing inside the hive, yet the colony was changing because she had finally treated location as a management tool. By early August, the old log was busier than either modern hive, and that was when the experiment stopped looking foolish and started becoming difficult to ignore. But the next development was more dangerous than failure, because Rachel had a result that could tempt her to believe her story too quickly. By late summer, beekeepers across the county were comparing losses. Weeks of heat had burned down clover and roadside bloom. Late-season forage was thinning, and Hank Dalton lost several hives that month. Even Rachel's 2 remaining Langstroth colonies showed lighter traffic at the entrances. Yet Walter's relocated hollow log hive kept flying hard from morning into the afternoon. It would have been easy to call that proof. Rachel could have said the old hive was stronger, that traditional equipment had somehow beaten modern beekeeping, or that Walter had known a secret everyone else had forgotten. But the notebook had taught her to distrust conclusions that arrived before evidence. She could not inspect the brood inside the log. She could not verify queen health, measure mite pressure, or see exactly how much honey remained. One surviving colony proved only that one colony had survived, so Rachel focused on what she could actually observe. She followed the workers' flight direction and found them pushing toward woodland margins where goldenrod, late blackberry, and scattered wild blooms were still feeding bees after the pasture near her modern hives had mostly gone brown. The difference seemed less like magic in old wood and more like access to a better late-season landscape. Rachel wrote 2 columns in her notebook: what I know and what I assume. That small habit kept correlation from turning into false cause. A few days later, Hank's truck rolled into Maple Ridge. Months earlier, he had joked about Rachel's free bees and a free hive. This time, he walked past the log without smiling, watched the entrance, and finally asked, "What did you do differently?" Rachel did not point to Walter's hive. She handed him the notebook. Hank had not come to be converted to primitive beekeeping. He had come because Rachel had built something more useful than a miracle, an observation system strong enough to show him where to look next. But what happened after Hank opened Rachel's notebook mattered far more than whether one unusual colony survived, because the lesson was about to spread beyond Maple Ridge. Hank began using her observation method and soon found several hives sitting in a low pocket where cold air collected overnight and late summer forage was thin. He did not abandon his Langstroth equipment. He changed where and how he paid attention. Word traveled. At first, beekeepers came to Rachel's farm to stare at the strange hollow log hive. Soon they stopped asking about the log and started asking about morning sun, wind, seasonal shade, bloom gaps, pollen colors, flight paths, cold pockets, and forage corridors. Rachel was invited to speak at a beekeeping meeting, and her message was simple: keep modern hives. Inspect brood, manage mites, monitor queens, but before opening the box, read the land around it. Her honey began selling locally, bringing in enough extra income to cover equipment and ease the pressure Caleb had carried. Then, on a cool October evening, Rachel and Caleb sat near Walter's old hive as the last bees returned through fading light. Caleb asked, "Can you teach me how you know where they're going?" Rachel showed him how to follow flight direction, recognize pollen colors, watch bloom cycles, and compare the bees from week to week. In that moment, Walter's real inheritance became clear. It was never the cracked log. It was a way of thinking. Observe, record, compare, adapt. Walter had passed that habit to Rachel, and now Rachel was passing it to Caleb. The old way had not defeated the new one. It had reminded her that modern tools become stronger when paired with careful observation. If this story made you think of an old farming lesson your family still remembers, subscribe to Solace Farm Stories and tell us in the comments. What hard-earned wisdom should never be forgotten?